Welcome to the Tech Pathfinder podcast, where we explore the impact of technology on the people in your workplace. Hello and welcome to the Tech Pathfinder podcast, where we explore the impact of technology on the people in your workplace. I'm your host, JP, and I help businesses get the most out of their technology through the engagement and support of their people. In today's episode, we're going to be breaking down what the publishing of the gender pay gap reporting data means for your business. In a few months' time, Australian organisations over 100 employees will have their pay gap data published by the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. If your organisation has not started taking steps to move to a more equitable workplace, now is a better time than ever when it comes to reform. In this episode, I'm going to be chatting with Natalie Flynn, founder and CEO of Equidi, to talk about what reporting and publishing means for businesses, the steps that you can take to move the needle in the right direction, and how you can get involved to support this fantastic movement. Before starting Equidi, Natalie had her career in HR, people and culture, spanning 15 years, and worked her way up through the C-suite. Natalie has worked in a range of different industries such as mining, oil and gas, and fast-growing tech scale-ups. Natalie is obviously passionate about all things DE&I, but also remuneration and business strategy and creating a thriving, equitable culture. Natalie's background is in organisational psychology, and prior to founding Equidi, she completed her Senior Executive MBA from Melbourne Business School. Welcome, Natalie.
Thank you. Wow, that sounds impressive.
Before we jump into some of the questions, Nat, I wanted to, get a little bit of background. Now, you and I met at a tech summit. You were in a pitch competition for your company, Equidi. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and Equidi itself.
Yeah, so I obviously worked my way through HR. I never intended to land in HR. I did org psych thinking I'd end up being a management consultant, and my first gig out of uni was in HR, and I loved it. So I love the diversity of the role. I love that you got to do so many different things and learn how companies actually worked from the inside. So I thought that was a better place to start because consulting is fantastic, but you work across a lot of businesses and not like deep in one business. So that's how I landed it. In terms of Equidi, Equidi was a passion of mine for quite some time. I always wanted to do my own thing. I was not sure for years what that would be. But as I worked my way up to the C-suite, I experienced the impact of gender bias firsthand. And that was with my first exec role. So I had gone to a more senior role. It was roughly a 40% pay reduction, and I was told I need to prove myself in the role. To me, I was like, yep, that makes complete sense. I'm happy to do that. But after 2 years of doing that and top performance ratings, nothing really changed. So I finally got the courage to go to the global CEO and presented him with the data. And once he understood that, he fixed it immediately. But the thing was, he couldn't change what he couldn't see. So a few years after, I had a phenomenal career at that business. It was one of my favourite people jobs. I went to another business. Company had got acquired, and I started a bit of consulting. They asked me to come in-house as the chief people officer. And when they offered the role, it was a bit of a, going back in time. So this was about 6 years later. I had been consulting to that business. I'd seen the REM, etc. And when they made the offer, they were a startup as well. So they said, we can't pay on REM, but we'll give you a great LTIP. When that offer came through, it was about a third of what my male peers were on. And a lot of them I had worked with previously, and they were levels beneath where I was in the organisation. So I took a step back and said, you know what, I'm not doing this again. I'm going to actually go do something about it, because I don't think anyone was ill-intentioned. I think that it's really challenging for companies to understand the data and then know what next steps to take. So with that in mind, that company was having their AGM. And they were getting lots of questions for their institutional investors about, why do you have no women on the exec team? Why do you have no women on the board? And I was kind of helping them step through that. But it occurred to me that without understanding and seeing things in a dashboard and making it simple, people just didn't know what to do. So in the middle of the night, I woke up and thought, gosh, we need a platform to help companies with this. And I got to working on it straight away. Fast forward now, that's almost 2 years now. And we've created Equidi and we're in the market. And I think we're making a great impact around pay equity in Australia.
So you've had some pretty stark and pretty obvious personal experience around, I guess, the pay gap in action, and the shifts. I guess the creation of your organization is around those personal experiences, and often, I think often it is something that's hidden. You can't see it if you're not looking for it. I think organizations are starting to look for it a little bit more. Before we
Yep.
jump into, I guess, some of the more particulars, it'd be good, I guess, if you can give us a little bit of context around what seems like a simple question, but sometimes can get a little confusing. What does equal pay actually mean, and how does that relate to the gender pay gap?
Yeah, great question. And it is confusing because we talk a lot in Australia about the gender pay gap. According to the WGA and how up until now they've been measuring that, the gender pay gap is basically the average pay between men and women, and the pay gap is the percentage of the variance. Um, Equal pay for equal work is more around the kind of role by role or like by like analysis of that.
Mm,
And so, whilst I completely understand with gender pay gaps, we need to get and understand them, but it's really the devil's in the detail, right? So, I think when it comes to equal pay, companies need to understand how to analyze that and how to understand what's triggering it and what's driving it. And in businesses to date, that's been really manual and really tricky for them.
mm,
It even comes down to role titles being just slight variances in them, and that makes it more difficult to pick that up when they come to analysing it. So the gender pay gap is an overall aggregate figure, but equal pay is looking at kind of role by role and like for like analytics around that. In companies at the moment, traditionally they've been doing that manually. And that's why with Equidi, what we've tried to do is take the manual side out of that and pull it through in real time. Because in any organization, you've got people coming into the organization, people moving around, and people going out pretty much every day. So to capture that in real time is really important because a lot of businesses who I speak to do their pay or gender pay analysis maybe once a year.
mm.
And to me, that's not enough. You need to keep on top of it, all the time to understand what's going on.
So I guess this next question sounds like there's an obvious answer to it, but I'd be keen to dive into it anyway. It's the What do you think are the main impacts of a gender pay gap at an individual level? Obviously, that's something that you've personally experienced, but also at a broader societal level.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned before, look, it's complex. It's a complex issue, and people can't sometimes get their head around and understand it, and then drill down into the detail. It's an issue that globally, if we can fix, it's to the tune of billions of dollars. Right, so it's not just an issue in Australia; it's a global issue. They say it's going to take, according to the World Economic Forum, 131 years to fix the gender pay gap. That impacts governments, it impacts companies, and it impacts society because no country can actually thrive or flourish if we don't utilize pretty much half of the population. And the challenge with women is not just gender pay gaps, it's representation and how we get women into businesses. And then not just that, how we grow them and develop them into senior leadership roles. In the ASX top 300, I think it's 93% of CEOs are male. So you can clearly see from the onset we can get women into business. It's just as their career progresses, they tend to drop off. And usually that's around the childbearing years. And men's careers seem to accelerate around that time and women's don't. And the gender pay gap increases significantly once
Mm,
they have a child. So it's a thing to start from grads coming into businesses. Um, Average graduates would earn 69,000 if you're a man. If you're a woman, it's about 67,000. And that just grows from there. So yes, it is challenging, not just on individuals. And the challenge with individuals is that a lot of people actually don't understand this. When I've been talking about equity and sharing this information with people, I always hear another story, oh, that happened to me, etc., etc. I was fortunate that I worked in people and culture, so I actually could understand. It wasn't just a hunch or a thought. I actually could see the information, but so many people can't see that. And that's why it's so important that we start working with companies to understand it. And it's not about looking backwards and, we've done the wrong thing. It's about looking forwards and how do we fix it and prevent it from happening in the first place.
So Australia's had the WGEA reporting. I often say WEGA, but it's WGEA reporting. So that's the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. That reporting requirement's been in place for some time now. What exactly do businesses need to? What information do they need to provide around their pay?
Yeah, for a business, it's quite complex. And the challenge is that they're looking backwards over the past year. And there's a number of different information points. You have to understand basically your whole profile of your workplace, and that includes all remuneration. So not just base salary; it's everything that was actually paid to employees, and whether that's base salary, super, bonuses, commissions, overtime, etc. And that's why it's really challenging when they look backwards over a year to figure all that out and work it out. Aside from that, then they need to compile a bit of a mapping exercise. What the Australian government has done really well is with the data collection. So we have a really rich data source, but that requires businesses to map all the roles and understand, I guess, a common structure or hierarchy. So they look at levels removed from CEO, and for management positions, companies need to map that through the reporting. It's a challenge for business in terms of, I think it was in 2021, a lot of businesses raised this with the government saying this is so time consuming, it's taking,
Mm,
a stack of time for our teams to complete. So the government did a review into what the challenges were with the reporting. So there was a full federal review. There was a number of different findings, but one of them certainly was around the data collection and how we make that easier for businesses. When I thought of the equity concept, I had obviously been in the role where you were responsible for submitting the data and getting this right. And
mm,
I used to pull my hair out every year. So I call it kind of your gender work. We'd sit there and do this massive report, pull all the historical data. There's a survey component just in terms of what you have and don't have in your business when it comes to gender equity. That might be, do you have a parental leave policy or guideline? Do you have a gender equity strategy, etc.? I'd sit there every year and tick those boxes. Some were yes, some were no. And every time it was no, I was like, I really want to do that next year. Before you know it, you've gone and done this report, you've submitted it, and you breathe a sigh of relief. And you're like, oh, thank God that's done. And you actually think that you've done your gender work for the year, but you haven't done anything. And so when we built the product, it was like, okay, we need to move away from treating gender equity as a compliance issue and actually start taking action. And I also found that it was really tricky to find good quality information and documentation. So there's a stack of research out there on gender equity. I know when I started the business, I'd read everything in Australia, everything globally to understand, okay, what is the secret sauce to cracking gender equity in the workplace? But it's so hard for a business to create this content, to understand it, and to then implement and embed. So with Equity, we've created that to make it really simple for businesses to do it. So I think twofold, the WGA reporting is great. We've got a great, rich data set globally. I think people look to us as being, some of the leaders or pioneers in that front, but we're burning their gender equity hours in doing that. So we need
mm.
to shift the mindset. How do we stop doing compliance and focus on taking action?
So, in my experience, the numbers that you spoke about just now that you need to provide from obviously doing them manually is painful, and that's a lot of that comes down to the fact that a lot of HRS providers and payroll providers, where you would expect this information to be really easy to just click a button and export, haven't actually been able to provide you a WGEA button to say, right, give me the report, out it comes, because of the level of detail in the report that's required.
Yep.
So you've talked about the role that equity certainly and technology can play in, I guess, advancing that and really taking the focus away from the task of the reporting and focusing your energies in the right place. But I'm keen to understand how you and the team cracked the code, because having been part of teams trying to do that in the past, it's not an easy feat.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't easy. I remember when I suggested it to our CTO. he was like, okay, really interesting, and a really challenging problem to tackle. And I'll talk to that in a minute. But I also talked to, as we were building the product, to a number of different stakeholders in HR and customers or future customers. And they're like, it's so painful. Technology cannot do this. So we've built bespoke tech that it's doing kind of two things. It's understanding as the role comes into the business, it's mapping. So where it becomes the ANSCO code, I guess, it's mapping that, it's mapping the level from the CEO, etc., and then the remuneration details. That's one part of it. And the other bit is that we're collating the whole thing and having to back it up basically every single day as a snapshot. So payroll and HRIS systems are a little bit more dynamic in terms of they're at every day you can see what's going on. But if you need to go back to, 12 months, 15,
Mm.
18 months and know the snapshot it's not there. So that's kind of the bespoke tech that we've had to build, is making sure that at any point in time you can understand what your org profile was.
So we've talked about the requirements of businesses that have been around for quite a while now, but that's changing pretty soon with the new rules around organizations over 100 employees having their results published by the WGEA. What do you think this means for businesses who are over 100 employees, who are in this position?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are unclear about what the changes are. Everyone knows, okay, gender pay gaps are being published, but what exactly does that mean?
Mm,
For year one, the WGA are going to publish overall median pay gaps, and that's because they hadn't collected full data sets in terms of CEO data was optional to report or not report. And therefore, the way the WGA has traditionally reported around averages, it's not really an accurate reflection. So for this year, they're going to publish median. From next year, they're going to publish mean and median. In addition to that, they're going to publish quartiles per business. So your lower pay quartile, a lower middle, an upper middle, and the top quartile, and then the average total remuneration as well. So it's a little bit more nuanced than what people think or understand. And that's along with their representation. So whether it's men, women, non binary, or other, they're going to show that as well.
mm,
I think businesses don't necessarily understand that. From those who I've spoken to, they might think, oh, okay, headline figure, gender pay gap, fine. But it's so much more than that. And I think that's going to be
mm,
game changing for a lot of businesses. Any company with over 500 people will also have to adhere to the new gender equity indicators and show what they're actually doing on that and demonstrate progress. And that's the first that the WGEA has ever done in terms of measuring, I guess, tangible outputs of action on gender equity. And some of those are around, if it is a representation issue, what are you doing about it? Some of it's around the new Respect at Work legislation, and how you manage and deal with sexual harassment cases. And some of that then is around, what are you doing in terms of pay equity, and how are you dealing and changing and driving down your gender pay gap. So it's a lot more detailed than what meets the eye at the first pass. And companies just need to understand what's coming. Every company will also be able to have a response to their gender pay gap or give context to it, because it's the first time this is happening.
mm,
And I always say the devil's in the detail. I think it's a great opportunity for companies to try and get ready now to be able to provide that response.
mm.
But I'm not sure, from those who I talk to, some aren't even aware of it, some are. But now's the time to be getting ready and preparing for that.
That response is interesting too, because you could I'm interested to know, like, are there instructions around what that response could be? Because I can see you as an organization using it as there's two ways you could go about it. You could be defensive about it and say, well, yes, there is these numbers, but this is because of the types of roles we have in the organization, or because of traditionally in our industry, yada yada yada.
Yeah.
Or you could take it as an opportunity to say, we acknowledge that this isn't an ideal reflection of what we want to be as an organization, and here are the steps that we're taking to move forward. Are there directions around how to provide that at the moment?
The direction has been around whether you want to submit a gender equity strategy or whether it's just a written response. So I think the government are willing to deal with either. But I think it's a really good opportunity for businesses to take stock of where they're at and actually understand it, because for the first time in this country, we're not only publishing pay gaps, but we're trying to get our head around and understand it. So I think
Mm,
for this, particularly this first year, and the way it's being measured is different to the way we'll be going forward. So I think it's a great opportunity. And if companies do have an existing gender equity strategy, I'd be providing that. But if they don't, and even if you do, you might want to give just more colour to that, because, like I said, those figures are headline figures. We call, in a technical sense, that's an unadjusted pay gap, meaning that there's a number of variables that impact it. But in terms of what that means for a business, it might not be as dire as what it seems, but you need to understand that, and you don't know unless you do your pay equity analysis and unless you have
mm.
a clear footprint and strategy to move forward on it.
So let's look at a hypothetical company. Then they're over 100, or say they're even larger than that. So they've got the ability to provide that color around their strategy. Um, Maybe there are some disparity, benefits aren't aligned. What what process should an organization go through if they haven't already got one to build a gender equity strategy? What does that look like in practice?
That's a great question, because it's one of those things, and I've got varying views on it. I actually think a gender equity strategy, or any strategy around equity or DEI, should be the fabric of the business and should underpin just everything you do and the way you work. But at the moment, it's sitting as a standalone. Do we have a gender equity strategy? Yes, we do. It's here, but it really
Mm,
should be within the people strategy, and just a way of working. In order to do it, it is quite complex to do it. So you need to firstly understand your data. And I've worked with a company recently who's a client of ours, and they've been with us for, I think, almost a year now. And as we went through their pay gap information, they were, trying to understand, why is our pay gap so high, etc. We drilled down right into it. We understood the median and we understood what was going on. The pay gap was actually quite low, but the challenge was their representation of women, particularly in technical areas of the business and in leadership, had a bit of work to do. So we sat back and thought, okay, I can see the data now and understand that, but what do we actually do about it? And that was largely a representation issue, and fueled by representation, because when you're aggregating numbers, that'll show up. But in order to get to that, you need to understand what the data is and then how to shape your strategy around it. So
mm,
that particular company has done some great things in the gender space, but now they're like, okay, we really need to consider our EVP, how we signal to market that we're trying to attract more women, and even the language of the website and the imagery around the website. I think they're like, okay, great. So we're not really trying to signal to women that this is a great place to work, a safe place to work, and that, it's a destination employer. So I think the strategy is so important, but you need to understand the data, and in order to have a great strategy and a successful strategy. Because if it's not data driven, then you could be chasing shadows around that. And so, with headline gender pay gap data, you need to understand the detail.
Outside of I guess parts of the strategy that might specifically target the gender pay gap, the behaviors in the organization, the way, the way that remuneration is calculated, manager development and training. What are some of the other, I guess, strategies that businesses can put in place to more broadly help the gender pay gap? And one that comes to mind is, looking at a job ad recently, and there was a mention at the bottom around, we realize, or we recognize, that a lot of women will actually stop at this point and not apply for the role. And I know there's been some studies around, um, the likelihood of men to apply for a role that they may not see themselves as qualified for is a lot higher than if a woman looks at the role, says they might not have all of the qualifications, so they're less likely to apply for it. And that, are there any other strategies that a business can put in place, I guess, to help more broadly, that to encourage, women to apply for roles that they're not applying for in droves?
Yeah, absolutely. I was recently at HR Tech in the US, and it was really interesting understanding the landscape when it comes to gender equity in America. So, in many of the states there, they've introduced the new pay transparency on job ads, and they think that the way forward. It's great because we've got transparency on job ads. It is great and it's a great first step, but it doesn't prevent a gender pay gap from occurring because a gender
Mm,
pay gap occurs at point of hire, basically. So it's kind of, you've accepted the role, here we go. So on the way through, and I call it basically a gender ecosystem, and there's a number of different things. It's from kind of attracting women into the business to appointing women to getting them into the business, growing them and developing them, and then supporting them through all their life transitions and journeys. So
mm,
I think a great place to start is absolutely to do that and to understand that, yes, in a lot of those cases, the data that you miss is, if you give a range on a job ad, it might say, okay, it's 80 to 100,000. Some people, and not just women, will self-select out of that. Oh God, no, I'm not earning that. I won't do it. So you're missing this
mm,
whole snapshot of the market that you've got no data on and can never have because you don't understand that decision making that's got you there. You can only deal with post decision. They're in the
mm.
mix and whether they get hired or not. So transparency is really important, but understanding then how you back that up with the right signals and encourage and create a safe space for women to want to work with you and want to apply for those jobs. And then on the way through, understanding at point of hire the gender pay gap. So after probably, I think it was 6 to 8 months after we had launched Equity, we were seeing in the product that a lot of companies were, and globally, you just pick up the paper. We need to close the gender pay gap. We need to fix it, right? But how
Mm.
about we stop creating it in the first place? And that's really challenging because it requires a lot of data to run through. Again, largely manual. So if you're doing high volume recruitment, that's really challenging. We launched the pay gap predictor functionality, which allows a business at the point of hire or promotion to run through the key details, and it will tell you exactly what it's going to do to your gender pay gap at that particular role. So if you're hiring a software engineer, it'll pull all your software engineers and show you representation and what the pay gap will be based on your proposed salary, and then the impact of that across the department and the business, etc. I think they're really important steps to deal with the pay equity issue, but so too is making steps forward and looking at it regularly. Because, as I said, a lot of companies will do that maybe once a year, but it's so
Mm.
dynamic; it needs to be much more frequent. And then looking at how you develop women within a business is really important too. I think there's different drivers, different variables, and different factors at play. So how do you make sure that if you're succession planning or if you've got learning and development initiatives, that you do have representation of women within that to enable them to grow and develop in the business too?
So, lastly, you recently launched the Gem. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, I guess, the motivations behind the Gem, what it is, and what you guys are hoping to achieve with it.
Yeah, it was really cool to be able to do the gem. The reason being was that I do a lot of speaking these days on the business and on the problem and trying to educate and help people understand what the gender pay gap is, what gender equity is, and how we move forward. What I
Mm,
was finding that a lot of people I'm talking to are within a business and it's, a couple of points of contact. But what I was getting was a lot of people who maybe aren't the decision maker in a business or aren't in people teams or aren't the CEO, etc. How do you connect to those people who want to be involved and want to support and are really passionate about gender equity?
mm,
And so with the GEM, it allowed us to create a space for people to be able to sign up and say, okay, I really support the vision, the purpose, and the mission of this. And they want to be part of it. So it was a really awesome thing to be able to do. And we hope to grow it, grow the membership base. We hope to be able to do events and learning in the future, but also just to stay connected to people so they understand exactly what's going on. Because the more we can educate and create awareness of the problem, the better placed people will be to be able to deal with these issues as they occur in the workplace and beyond.
excellent. Well, we'll make sure that we pop in a link to the website in the episode notes. So if anyone is interested to find out a little bit more, get involved, I highly recommend having a look and following it up. Natalie, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time out and jumping in and having a chat. I think it's one of those really important factors of of life that we have this disparity that we need to address, and I think the technology solution that you've put together is fantastic. Having seen it myself, but also the drive through the gem and through your support is fantastic. So thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you. It's been great chatting.
Cheers.
This episode is brought to you by Equidi. Equidi is set to level up the ledger on gender by empowering businesses to understand and close their gender pay gaps. Equidi makes the complex simple by integrating real-time data and analytics so you understand pay equity and representation across every part of your business. The platform connects data to strategy, and by serving meaningful actions, it'll guide you to create a more equitable and inclusive workplace. Did we mention we have you covered on your WGEA reporting? Yes, you heard that right. Equidi automates your WGEA and board reporting so you can focus your energy where you need it most. See the change, be the change. Do good business even better. Thank you to Equidi for supporting this episode.